Hey everybody, so we're getting really close to the end of the class. Today we're going to look at the kind of last thing on the course objectives to do. Then I have a few odds and ends for next week, but again, next week is going to be mostly lab time to get everything finished up and working. The to-do list for here, probably can't see it on the camera, is only like that long. So a very short list of things to do. We're going to look at some SQL stuff, and my original plan had us looking at it, the MySQL commands, and then doing it in the database, doing it on a web page. But what we're going to look at is actually considered a security breach on a web page. So I just dropped that web page part. We'll just look at it in the MySQL because it's back when you see it. It's stuff we would do in the background as administrators, not necessarily pass the privileges on to the general public. So putting it on the web page is kind of a security breach, or could lead to big security breaches. So it's something that we typically don't do in the front end. It stays in the back end. So we'll look at it quickly in MySQL, the syntax and stuff for that, which you probably saw it in the DBMS 110 class. So that'll go quickly. And then we're going to kind of walk through, like normal, the class example, the stuff we saw the other day, actually put that in our site. Only I want to focus, when we do that, I want to kind of focus on the method a little bit more than the syntax. It's still going to go pretty quick. It'll go very, very quickly, but those class examples and the programming assignments every week, those have gotten big over the course of the semester. And I kind of noticed it last week. It looked like everybody knew the syntax of what to go in, put in there, but just jumping in and intermingling that syntax right in that big project that was already working seemed to cause a little bit of some stumbling blocks. So I wanted to address how we do that. You know, we have this big thing already working. We need to add a new feature into it. So when we go over the class examples, I'm going to focus more on that than the syntax. We saw the syntax the other day. So basically, the normal walk through what you need to do on the homework, or something very similar to that. But first off, I wanted to look at something that I believe there was a little bit of confusion around. So way back at the beginning of the semester, when we were reading and writing files, and in particular, reading the chapter in the textbook about what they had about reading and writing text files, there was a function mentioned in there called serialize, and I mentioned it very briefly in lecture, because serialize, we use that function to translate PHP objects into a form we can write to a binary file and then retrieve directly from that file. And at the time we looked at reading and writing files, well, we hadn't seen any PHP things that we could really write to a binary. All we really had to write to a file was strings and numbers and maybe some Booleans, just our basic, most basic type of data. It works with arrays, and then when we got to object-oriented stuff, the lecture got cut back a little bit from the original plan, and that serialized thing just kind of got skipped over, because at that point we had something we could serialize and put in a text file, but we stripped down the object-oriented stuff from the original plan, and that serialize got pushed back until we got to databases. And then the other day when we were going to put image data in a blob, seeing how to put the image data directly into the database instead of just storing it somewhere, so yeah, the question just popped up in the chat room that talk about binary array. Does it have to mean a blob? And so that's where the confusion arose. And then that was mentioned the other day as well when we talked about blobs. Somebody mentioned the serializer function, and those aren't necessarily connected. So a blob is binary. A blob is just a spot in a database to store binary code. And everything on a computer is binary code. So anything on a computer can go into a blob. And serialize is something different. So I'm going to do a quick, very, very quick example to hopefully help clear up the serialize and the blob thing. They're not connected. We just used it there. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And I'll just open the File Explorer and go to the folder with all our class examples. SDEV 253, the class examples here, and I'll make a new folder. So Control-Shift-N makes a new folder, and I'll call this serialize. Just a really quick example. I'm gonna do 2 files, just which is really more than we need to do here, but hopefully a quick example. So I'm gonna go to Notepad++, and I'll have one file called store.php and one called retrieve.php, which I might have just spelled wrong. I'll see in a second. Yes, create those files, both PHP files. And I'll do the store one first. So here's our situation. This is something that's going to show up a lot. We're going to use arrays here for the example, but any custom objects we would build would follow this same pattern. So let's say we have an array with a bunch of data in it. So stuff's going to be a new array. I'm going to put some things in here. So an index first, that'll refer to, maybe the number 1. Then what's some more indexes? Tall, that's a good index. So refer to that, to the name Shack. What's the name? Capitalize that. So the index tall refers to the name Shack. Name index called fruit refers to some word, maybe apple. And another index called answer, and I'll just refer to a Boolean in this case. So some sort of data, I just kind of made that up, but you all have seen that before, right? In our scripts, we're going to have all sorts of different pieces of data in different formats and things. And then we have it in an array here, makes it easier to work with and whatever bigger thing it actually goes to. But we need to store it so we can use it next time we're here as well, not just this time. So our basic storage is a text file, right? We saw those. So I'll create a handler, call it toFile. I'm going to open a text file for writing. I'll just call it array.text. I want to write some stuff to it. And well, then we can call fwrite. Grab that toFile handler to write the stuff. And this is going to throw an error. I'm just going to say, I want to write that array to a file so I can use it later. And then go ahead and close the thing. So all that should look very familiar, right? This is going to throw an error, but something that we want to happen, right? We have a bunch of data in an array or maybe an object that we created, and we want to use it the next time we run this script. We don't want to have to enter all that data again. So we want that to be available in the future. So we're going to write it to a file to keep it around. And if I go run this, right now it's going to throw an error, but I want to look at the errors that it throws. Hopefully it won't take too long here. I had this thought that I might try between after next week and before the summer semester, try doing the Zoom calls for the virtual classes on one of the machines that runs parallel machines, as opposed to virtual machines. I could put a virtual machine on here and have two machines, but I think one of the ones that would run full parallel machines, like on the Chromebook, have two machines running at the exact same time. I'm wondering if I do the Zoom call and the browser from parallel machines, if it would fix that lag issue that happens when we jump on the open Google Chrome at the same time we're on a Zoom call. Is that slowing down and having to wait is a little annoying at times, right? Especially when we're already very constrained for time anyway. So here's that script. And it gave us this error. fwrite, that function we use to put stuff in a text file, expects the second parameter to be a string, and we gave it an array. So that's what serialize does. That's all the serialize function does. If we turn it, so if we say serialize, it turns that into a string, a very special kind of string. Because another one, the textbook really likes this, and examples really like this, is var dump. That just grabs everything in the array, throws it back out as a string, but it does so in a way that we cannot get it back. It just throws it out as a string and we're done with it. So like dump it is, we're just taking it to the dump, throwing it away. But we're gonna throw it away in the form of a string in case we want to see what's there. Examples really like that one, but I have never really come up with a useful use for it because we can't get the information back.
I know you used that. I know you used that on some of the stuff that we worked on trying to get the stuff out of my post array.
Oh yeah.
But that was just to see on the screen what was in the thing, and that's all we cared about.
Just to see what the very first line, so that everybody else knows what we were talking about. It's very useful. We were having trouble accessing an array, so the very first line in the code we did echo var dump the post array, and then it told us exactly what was in the post array, and we were able to figure it out from there. So I guess that was useful there, as a debugging tool to see what we had, but we can't get the data back that way. Serialize does the same thing. It takes everything in the array and just throws it out as a string, but it does it in a way that we can get it back. So if I come over here and reload this, well, there's no error message this time. So if I hop back over to File Explorer, that a text file got written. So if we take a look at this, we did see this since we put it in a database, we kind of saw this format before. But here's what we have. We have an array. It says we have an array with 4 elements in it. The first thing is a string with 5 characters. And those 5 characters are FIRST, our associative index. Then the next thing is an integer. And that integer is the number 1, what we stored in there. And we can go on through there. So the next thing is a string with 4 characters. And that happens to spell out the word tall. And the next thing that follows that is a string with 4 characters, spells out the word check. And there we have all of our data. Strings and integers are over here. This string with 6 characters, our index answer refers to a Boolean set to true. So the data is stored in a recoverable format. And that's what serialize does, and unserialize. That's why I did a second file, so we can unserialize that and get the data back. So then we don't have to do a whole bunch of fancy tricks and several loops in order to read the data back in and put it back in the array and try to make sure it's organized and all that. We can just read it right back in. So I'll make a handler, a from file handler, opening that array.txt file for reading this time. And now I'm just going to put it in the variable stuff. And again, I'm going to do it wrong first so that we can see the error message and know how to handle that. Stuff is going to be read that file handler from file, and we're going to read to which way were we seeing this? Did we use file size? I didn't want to introduce something new. There's more than one way to do this. I think we were using file size, right? We haven't done this in a moment in class. I didn't want to introduce something new here. Hopefully that looks familiar.
So file size just means read it until you run out of file.
Yes. Is that the one we were using before?
I think we did.
Okay.
Because I know there was another thing where what was end of FEOF or something.
Yeah, the end of file.
Yeah, we didn't do that. I think we did. I think we did file size.
Okay. There's also a linked one. There's a bunch of different ones. Kind of like back to that day one talking about PHP. For the first 20 years, there was no official standard. So it was just programmers around the world all made a whole bunch of functions, and we end up with thousands and thousands and thousands of functions already made to work with, which are kind of nice. But I can't remember. I think that's the one we looked at in here. And then once we have stuff, I want to maybe grab something out of it. Echo from that stuff array.
Do we need a semicolon, or is it underneath your? Oh, there it is. It's underneath.
Yeah, it was underneath. So I want to grab whatever was stored in that tall index in the array, right? And that way, just work with the data that we'd already put in the array. So if I come over here and go to that website page now, which I think I spelled incorrectly, but I'll try. Retrieve.php. I don't know what the browser is doing there. Let's try that again. Actually, I'll do this. I go back to the folder, I'll be able to click on it no matter how I spelled it. Oh, it's just going really, really slow from the Zoom call.
Hey, Chris, while you're waiting for that to come up, can you go back to the code? So I'm writing it down. I was at, where did I lost my code?
Oh, so all we did was the read from the file, like we saw earlier in the semester, and just echoed back one of the elements in that array. There's still an error. We're going to look at the code here in just a second. There we go. So we get this error. Illegal string offset tall on line 7. Okay, don't know what that means off the top of my head, but I know what line 7 means. So we can go look over there and see if we can track this down. And the problem happens to be the word tall. So that is a good clue. So we come over here to line 7. And tall is our index. So maybe that's the problem, right? I think, well, maybe that's the problem. Let's take tall out of there. I'm going to hit Control X to cut it. That way it's still on the clipboard. I can paste it back in there in a moment. And reload this. Well, now we get what's actually in the text file. We get all that information. The thing we wanted is there, but it's not, we didn't want the rest of that. So the unserialize function is what turns it back into an array. So serialize turns it into recoverable data in text form. And then unserialize undoes that. So when we did that to the arrays to store them in the database, we could have put that in a text field. I think we had short arrays that day for that example. So they would have fit in a normal text field. So yeah, hopefully that kind of clears up the confusion. Oh yeah, then I'll paste that back in there. Whoops. Helps if I push the right button. There we go. Are those right? Yeah. So I'll paste that back in there, and now we should be able to get just the data. So the serialize function doesn't really have anything to do with our database. There seemed to be some confusion about that the other day. Serialize takes a PHP object and puts it into text in a format that we can recover it. And then unserialize recovers things that were serialized. Hopefully that cleared up the issue around that. Does that make sense to everybody? So we use that when we put stuff in a blob, but it's not, putting it in a blob was not dependent on that. That's just what we have to do to an array in order to write it to a blob. Yeah, we could have used var dump to put it in the array or put it in the database that day. But like we saw a moment ago, if we use var dump, we can't get it back. Well, we have a string, but we'd have to parse through that string to get it back. Yeah, so we wanted it in a way we can get it back. So a lot of times we want to serialize the stuff because we don't need to split it up either. If that database is specifically made for our PHP scripts in that particular website, well, whenever we get back the data, we want it in the format for our PHP sites. Hopefully that cleared up that issue. So the next thing, and really the last thing on the list of course objectives, is some SQL stuff, or in our case, MySQL, or in particular, MariaDB flavor of MySQL, which is one of many SQL languages. But this one's pretty much the same. What we're going to look at today, it doesn't really, so SQL Server, link, MySQL. So in at least the 6 most common flavors of SQL languages, what we're going to look at today is exactly the same. So I guess we could say SQL instead of MySQL stuff. So upload files, the .sql and .csv to MySQL. That's the next topic to look at. And by now, you've surely noticed the advantage of creating your database and tables by uploading a text file, right? That's how we did it on the class example, and I think that's what everybody turned in with the homework, was just a .sql file. So I could, when I went to grade it, I could just click import and reinstall that. So obviously, we have that import button in php My Admin, which we're going to look at that afterwards. We're going to do a quick pass at just the regular syntax in the command prompt like we did last time, and then go look at the more useful buttons. That way we see both of them, because, well, the language is actually that syntax, the stuff we type up. So we need to see that to learn the language. And the buttons are useful. That's what we're actually going to use every time. So we'll look at the language and then come back and look at the buttons. And when I did my test run this morning, it took talking through it It took 25 minutes. So it's not going to take as long to go over it. So the SQL files, we saw that. Give text file. The .sql extension. And most of our text editors, most text editors will change colors. Our technical term for recognizing a language like that is called lexing, but I figured it might make more sense in the notes if I just said change colors, because that's what we want. It makes it a whole lot easier to put our code together if it changes colors and we know we spelled the words correctly and stuff. Then we can just upload that and we have all those queries, usually our create queries. And when we did this before, we also put our insert queries here, right? But insert queries can still be a bit of a headache sometimes, right? There's a lot to putting together insert queries. So having another way to fill our tables would be nice. And that's where the CSV file is. So the second one on the list there, that's comma separated values. .csv. And after we put the first one together here in a few minutes, when you see what the default software for opening the CSV file is, it'll hopefully make a whole lot more sense what it is. So it's comma separated values. And essentially what it is a text file of data. We just put our data in a text file, lots and lots of data, as much as we want. You know, we can make tremendously large text files. Each record gets its own row. Each record gets its own line. So if we have, say, 4 fields in our database, we'll have the 4 fields for one record of data, then we'll hit enter and have 4 fields for the next record of data and just continue that. So it kind of looks like a table. And each field, I'm standing at an odd angle to right there. So each field is separated and in parentheses, I'm going to put by commas. By comma. And I put that in parentheses because, well, like the name implies, the default one is going to be by commas. But we're programmers. We tell the machine what to do. We can separate them with any symbol we want. It's just really odd to use something other than commas. And well, we'll see it in a moment. Most computers will try to open this with the default spreadsheet software. And in that case, each value goes in its own cell, which I plan to open one with a spreadsheet software and actually see that. And hopefully it'll make more sense of what the type of file is. But it makes our insert queries so much easier. And well, we'll do a quick pass at it in the syntax for the language, and then we'll look at it in PHP My Admin, which is the most popular software to manage a database these days. To manage a relational database, I guess I should make that distinction since our discussion board this week is the topic is relational versus non-relational databases. But we're looking at SQL databases, so relational databases. Yeah, most any of our GUIs have the buttons to upload this one. So our queries for it, the .sql files, to upload those, our query is just source. That's a C, might not look like it. So source, I'm going to call it some file.sql. And this is important. That hopefully this color.
Chris, I'm sorry. What did you say the action? What did you say was the outcome for using the source for the SQL?
That uploads it.
Okay, thanks.
So if we have a big SQL file, this is the query to upload it. And notice there are no quote marks. That almost looks like a quote mark where I started to write that above it. Because that makes it usually so often that I've expressed to the point that our file names and file paths always go in as strings. But this is one of the rare examples, rare cases that it does not go in as a string. So a source, and then that some file, whatever our SQL file is called, oh, and then a semicolon. And then there's a location note. If we're going to create a database, obviously we need to run this query at the very top level when we're at the host level before we actually go in to work with the database. But if the database is already created and our .sql file only creates tables, then obviously we want to go into that database before we run this query, because all we're going to do is create tables, and we have to be in the database to create tables, not just on the host. The next one's a lot. There's several parts to it. So for a .csv, and actually, I'm going to put or others. We're only going to look at the .csv file, but there's more than one sort of text file we can put data in, right? That's the comma separated values isn't the only way we can represent data as a text file. XML is very common. Whenever we get to, after we look at it in SQL, and get to the PHP My Admin where we have all the nice buttons and stuff, I'll also point at the export thing, and you'll see that there's lots of ways we can, lots of different file types we can export to. CSV is just one of them on that list. But we run the same query to load it in. And it's kind of a long one. So load data in file and then our path, which I ran out of room. So like path slash some file .csv. So then our file name, load data in file into table. Then our table name. Are you just switching devices?
Sorry, my Wi-Fi is unstable.
Oh, okay. I thought you might have been getting ready to switch into your phone, go run the, take care of the family duties and stay in class the way you often do. But so where was I? Okay. Load the data from this file into a table, whatever table we want to do it. But then we have to describe our data. So a CSV file has, well, every field is separated by commas. So we say that first. Field terminated by a comma, and it's coming in as text, so we need that in quote marks, a comma, and well, then it's a text file, which I think to spell text wrong over there. It's a text file, which means everything's also going to be enclosed in strings. So we have to say that. Enclosed by double quotes. This is kind of the standard way to do that. Single quote, a double quotation mark wrapped in single quotes. That way we don't need an escape sequence to do it. There's different ways, but we have to say, somehow tell MySQL explicitly that everything is wrapped in quotation marks because we're sending in text. It looks like a lot of up here. We're going to see it typed out, and I wanted to go over it at least once before we typed all this. And then this note, each record on its own line. So then we say lines terminated by a line break, a line feed, or a carriage return. And one of the first things when we get over to the example is to see how that is going. And I'm completely out of room. We can also ignore header rows, but when we type up an example here in a few seconds, or here in just a couple minutes, we can also ignore header rows. So load data infile, and then the file name into table, and the table name is the same no matter how we have our data stored. Then after that, we have to describe to MySQL how the data is stored. So we have to describe these three things. The fields are separated by commas. So we say fields are terminated by a comma and give it that symbol. And then it's a text file, which means it's all coming in as strings, which isn't a problem if we have, like, say, names and towns. But, well, you all have seen my generic class example a couple times now. I always do name, age, and town. That middle one is an integer. So we don't want the computer SQL, we don't want MySQL thinking that integer is a string. So we have to explicitly say everything's coming in as a string. So it's enclosed by quotation marks. So make sure and check if it can be turned into a number or a Boolean or some other format, if that's what's supposed to be there. And then each record gets its own line. So let's say every line ends with a line break, a line feed, or a carriage return. Then there's a couple big issues. The first one, which we'll see here when we work through this example, is that MySQL isn't allowed to read from just any folder, even on the computer it's on. There's a short list of folders it can read from. There's a config file where we can go in and tell it other folders it can read from. But you have to manually set this config file, and sometimes might not have access to that config file for various reasons. Right? If somebody else is hosting our site, hosting our database, we might not have complete and total access. So what I usually do is one file or one folder that we know with certainty that MySQL can read from is the folder where MySQL is installed in. So I'll put the .sql and .csv file together in a normal working directory. Usually on my computers, it's on the delete folder. That's what I keep that around for. And then I will copy that over to the bin folder on XAMPP or on the domain host where MySQL is actually installed at, read from it, and then delete that copy that I moved over there just to be read, which is actually what php My Admin does in the background when we click the import button. It makes a copy of that in a spot where MySQL is allowed to read from. We could manually set it, but what I think is easiest is just to, after you get everything ready, put a copy of it in a file, or a file folder that you know MySQL can read from. Yeah, and sometimes on domain hosts, it might take a lot of digging around to look for it. I looked for about 15 minutes on that Infinity free one that a few people have been using and didn't see it. So that's just for typing in the language, because there we have PHP My Admin software and we have a button that's clearly labeled that says import that we can do all this from and not type the complicated queries. So yeah, the process is we'll create them. We'll create our .sql files to create a database and some tables. And then we'll put all the data to load into it into CSV files, copy those over to the MySQL bin folder on XAMPP. That's the one here on the computer I'm on right now to load it up, where the language is installed. Then we'll do all that database stuff, exit the database, and then delete those folders. It's always that. So copy them into a folder where you can read them from, get them ready, copy to a folder where you can read them from, do all your database stuff, and as soon as you exit the database, delete those files, so because they don't really need to be there. They only needed to be there for reading it. And that's what the import button on my PHP My Admin does. It makes a copy of it someplace where MySQL can read from, reads from it, and then deletes that copy. So we just have to do that manually.
But do we have to do that do we have to do that with the import, or it's going to do it automatically after it reads it?
Oh, it does it automatically.
Okay. And then when we do it for ourselves to read from it and do any of those updates after we do the import and all that, then we should go ahead and purge or dump the stuff that we created the copy. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because it was only a temporary copy, and that's what the button on, well, not just PHP My Admin, any interface for working with the database, that's what it does, because it'd be too complicated to go change config files automatically and stuff. So it's like, okay, just put it here somewhere for.
I'm glad you said that, because I have a million files now. So if I do that, as long as I know it's saved somewhere, then I can go ahead and delete it.
Yeah, so let's take a look at this. I have a list here of common problems, which I'll point out in the example. Actually, two lists on the .sql files. There's one common problem there, probably hard to see. For .sql files, there's one common problem, but on the CSV files, there's a handful of common problems that I wanted to point out. Things to watch out for. Let's see, 147, and this should go fairly quickly. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Does anybody have any questions about that concept before we get started? I assume that means no questions then?
Not yet. I'm gonna watch and see, then I'll let you know the question.
Okay. Yeah, and like I pointed out, well, this is one of the things we're supposed to cover in the class. We're covering it with we're looking at the syntax, but we have a button that does it. So there's a much easier example coming up in a moment. I guess the only new part here is putting the CSV file together. So we'll look at that first. I'm gonna go over to my delete folder, the scratch folder I keep on my desk, or on my, all of my computers always have a delete folder. It's just a place to work at.
That is so smart.
I move stuff to if I'm going to save it, I move it to a more permanent location. So I need a couple files here. So like always with programming, they're going to be text files. So I'm going to open Notepad++, and I need something to initialize the database. So I'm going to call it initdb.sql. And then I'm going to go ahead and do 2 tables just to go one more pass at the formality stuff of tying tables together and things like that, and having the full thing in front of us. So I'll have one with all the data called people.csv, or some of the data, and then more data over in something called taste.csv. So initdb.sql, people.csv, and taste.csv. So go ahead and create all 3 of those files. Yes, yes, yes. Go ahead and create all 3 of them. And I guess we'll start with initializing the database. So what I had in mind is kind of my standard class example, only a step further for reviewing MySQL purposes. It's been 7 weeks of a busy course load since most of y'all had the MySQL class. So just a quick review on some of that. So we're going to create a database and give it some sort of name. I'll call it testing 1, 2, 3. And well, obviously then we want to use that database to use testing 1, 2, 3. That should look familiar. Once we have a database, we need to put some tables in it. Create a table called people. And last time I skipped the IDs or did auto increment. Auto increment can be a little bit funny with CSV stuff. That's one of the ones I put on here. So if your data is going to have an auto increment ID, it can be a little bit funny with the CSV files. So what I think is easiest is to run the create it without that ID field for the auto increment, create it, and then upload all the data from the CSV file, and then use an alter table query to add in that auto increment row. And we're going to see alter table before the end of the day today by my plan for this day. I'm just going to go ahead and put IDs here. I'll call it per ID for person ID. I'll just do a varchar this time. The 4 is probably enough. Some alphanumeric code identifier. I'll just make up a unique one each time instead of actually letting the computer keep track of a number or something. So just some sort of identifier thing. And then my normal data for class examples. Name, we'll leave up to 32 characters for that. Age is always an integer. And the town people live in, which town is regular English. So a normal string or varchar, and 32 characters probably cover most towns. It'll cover our examples today. And then to cover all the database stuff, right? All the relationships and things like that, we got to have at least 2 tables to see a relationship. So we're going to put that in here. Create a second table. We're not going to do much queries with it. I just wanted to kind of review that stuff since we only briefly touched on it the first time we did the MySQL example. So basically the same thing. We're going to make a taste table, but this time I want to use the primary key. Oh, I didn't forget that ID. I want that to be the primary key for that table. So I'm going to use that primary key as a foreign key over here. So I need the same table. The person ID, need the same field as the other table. So put that on the table, and then I'll do a couple things this time. Maybe fave food, which is just going to come in as a string and save drink. Whoops, drink. If I can spell the word correctly, which again, coming in as a string. And then we need to set up all of that, the relationship. So we need to create a constraint, which the pictures are in my way. The cursor's typing way over there. And so we need to create a constraint for a foreign key. And we're going to take our per ID field, so wrap it in parentheses in our create queries to indicate it's a field. And that references or refers to, so our keyword is references, the people table has a per ID field in it as well. All that stuff should look somewhat familiar, right? Is everybody confused about that stuff, or you remember seeing that before? Just to create the relationship between the table. So explicitly say that these two fields are the same thing, the same field. They're just on different tables. So that'll work
I
for our
don't think I've
database.
seen references yet, but it does make sense.
Yeah, we have to say what, so wrapped in parentheses with no other words around it means that that's the field on this table that we're working on. And then the other one, it's wrapped in parentheses to say it's a field, but we gave it the other table name as well. And yeah, a lot of parts of SQL make sense, the words we use. So this foreign key refers to the primary key over there. It makes a lot of sense when we think about it in English right there. It's one of the nice things about SQL. And before, the last time we did a bunch of insert queries, but insert queries can be kind of a headache to work with, right? They're big and long, they get messy. There's a lot of places to make an error in an insert query. So a better way to do that is just have a file of data that we can upload. So what do we have on our people table? Our people table had the per ID field, name field, an age, and a town. And that first row basically shows what a CSV file is. It's our data separated by commas. So now I'm just going to make some stuff up. So P01 for person one. Sally, maybe she's 33 years old and lives in Salem. Person 02, Charlie is 64 years old and lives in Charlestown. Person 04, Helen, 19 and lives in New Albany. Person 05, Corey is maybe 23 and lives in Corydon. And did you notice I kept trying to push a space? That's one of the first issues I was going to put. So I'll go ahead and do that here and talk about it. That's the first thing. That's the second thing on my list of common problems. Because out of habit, after we type a comma, we want to put a space there and make it nice and readable for a human. But that's the thing. Remember, spaces are only for a human. The computer does not need a space. And actually, it's going to throw it off. I'm going to erase this line here in a second. I just wanted to mention this. If we went around and went over there and did select name from people, like later when we get to the database, where town equals Corydon, that query would not run. It would tell us it can't find anything.
Because it's looking for a space before the C, isn't it?
Yes, it's looking for space cordon. Or if we did it, if we did space cordon, it would find Corey. Or the same thing over here. If we put a space in there and tried to format that nicely, it wouldn't tell us his name is Corey. It would tell us his name is Space Corey. Or we wouldn't be able to search for it. So the first thing, common issue to remember is no spaces. Spaces are for humans. This file is for a computer. We want a computer to read this, and spaces cause a problem with a computer. Because we could set up a fancy script that strips out spaces, right? That's not hard. We just read in the string, and any place we have a space, we remove that character. Some basic parsing. But then we have other problems, right? Because if we tried to do that, what would happen here? So we don't want to go around manually removing spaces. So just make sure you don't put them in, or if you forget and out of habit, put a space after a comma every time, because that's how we write English. Go back and take them out.
So there's not a trim function.
We could run it through a trim function. And yeah, we have left trim, right trim, or trim engine, or basic trim. We have all three of them. But we still want to be careful. There might be places where we have a space. Like maybe the ID means something. And when we're putting this data together, we don't know what this particular person's ID is, but we don't want to put null in there. We don't want our database thinking there's something null, so we just put a space there. And that way it puts in a space character, and it doesn't report as null, but it looks empty when a human looks at the table without actually counting as null. There might be reasons to do that. In most cases, it'd probably be better to have it null and check for it, but that was just the first thing that came to my mind. So there's places where that trim function does fall apart. But again, it depends usage to usage. It's better just remember a computer. This is a file for a computer to read, not a human. So spaces are for humans.
So
Computers don't
remove
need them.
spaces and use null for blanks.
Yeah, because we can't have a blank thing here. We can't do that if we don't know his ID. And then we'd have to add extra things in to allow a whole bunch of extra lines in the instruction to allow for that.
Now, I'm sorry. What did you say happens if we don't remove the spaces? I heard when Joe was talking about the trim function, and you were talking about, because I lost it for a second. What happens if we don't remove the spaces?
So like if this was a space, this data does not say cordon. It's that whole string. Our data is then space cordon. So when we run queries, if we didn't include that space, it wouldn't be able to find it. It wouldn't be able to use it. That makes sense? So like select name from people where town equals cordon would be empty. We'd have to do where town equals space cordon in quote marks. We have 1, 2. Oh, wait, I skipped the 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have 4 things. So then we can get our other table set up the same way. All our data set up. Instead of writing an insert query, we just write out the data. So we had a person ID, fave food, and fave drink. And we could skip the header rows, leave the header rows off. Personally, that's just my personal thing. It really, really bothers me to have a CSV file without labels on it. And to have a whole bunch of data and no labels for that data just bothers me. So I'm just like, oh, it's really easy to deal with the header rows. So I always go ahead and put the labels in there. And that way, if we're wondering what a file is and open it up, we have labels and not just raw data that we have to figure out. So we had 4 people. Maybe person 1 likes, I'm just making this up, cheeseburgers and Coca-Cola. Person 02 likes hot wings and sweet tea. Person 3 like salad and Gatorade. Guess maybe something healthy. I couldn't think of a healthy drink quick enough. Maybe I could have put salad and smoothies to indicate healthy stuff, but that'll work. It's just test data. In person 4, tacos and water. Just some basic data there. So that, you see how it's nice. It's a lot easier to set that up than an insert query, right? We kind of write it all out that way. And the next thing I wanted to look at, hopefully help make sense of how it's viewing it, is notice the default software that those CSV files are going to open with. So if I just double click on the file, it tries to open with Excel.
That's what I was going to say. Is that Excel?
Yes. So that's a good way to think about it. I don't actually have Excel on here, so I have to wait for it to open up so I can close it. I use Google Docs. I use the Google Office suite for everything on all my devices, my phones, my tablets, all of my laptops. It's so much easier when everything's online and I can just access it from whatever device I'm beside. But I always have to wait for those error messages. So you can see each piece of data went into its own thing. So one way to think about it is you could think about it as a spreadsheet without anything but the cells. It's the cells on a spreadsheet without the lines or any nice formatting or anything. We just separate all the stuff with commas to separate our fields or columns, and line feeds, some sort of line break to separate our different records.
Can you
So
throw a couple errors on purpose? Like
yes.
maybe even add the space you were saying, so we can just see how that works.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see that. I have a couple in mind. I'll go ahead and do that one. We'll do that. We'll look at errors when we get to the button one. It's so much easier to do it there. Will that be okay, Dave? I have.
Oh yeah.
2 errors I was going to throw in the language syntax, and then we'll throw those errors in the we can upload it really quickly from a button. Because now it's that issue that I pointed out a moment ago that MySQL can't read from just any file. We'd have to go in the config file and tell MySQL it's allowed to read from my delete folder here. So what I like to do is just grab all these and copy those over to a folder that I know MySQL can read from. So if I come to the XAMPP folder, then there's the MySQL folder. And then in this folder called bin, this is where the MySQL language is actually located at. So I know for certain that MySQL can read from the folder that it's located in. So I'll just paste those in there. Which also, by the way, this might as well point it out here. I know that there's got to be an icon. Oh, there's a little gear icon. So here's the config file you would, the my.config is what you need to change if you want to tell it where it can read from. And now we can do our MySQL stuff. So I'm going to open command prompt by holding Windows X to get all of our, the list of all of our Windows control functions. And then hit C to go in command prompt, open command prompt. Then CD changes the directory. So I want to change to C drive, the XAMPP folder, MySQL folder, bin folder, and I'll work there. Now I can open MySQL. Just use the localhost and root user, which I do not have a password set, but if you do have a password set on yours, just -p and then whatever your password is. And that gets us into MySQL. So our initialize query, that creates a database, right? So we need to be at the top level. If you already have the database and yours starts on like what's line 3 here, you would want to use the use query first so that you're actually in a database to create the tables in. So just make sure you're in the appropriate spot for it. And then the word source, and then the path to it. Which on a Windows machine here, we just type the file name and it would find it because it'll look in its own location first. On the Linux file, we'd have to type it. So I'll go ahead and type the whole path. It won't hurt to have the absolute file path to it. In that folder we're at, where we just pasted that stuff, there's a file called initdb.sql. Oh, whoops. And I already made that mistake I said to watch out for. No quote marks here. There's only a handful of spots where we don't put quotation marks around a file path when programming, and this is one of them. Actually, you'll have seen 2 of them. Just remember, in CSS, we don't put quotation marks either. So there's only a couple of spots. Usually file paths get quotation marks because they're a string. But when we do a source, we're referring to something that exists. Kind of like when we refer to a table or a field in MySQL. It's something that we know exists, so no quote marks. So run that. Well, you can see down here, we're using the database now. So it created all of it. I do show tables. We have our 2 tables. Now we just have to get that data into it. And that's that big messy thing on the board. So the words all make sense, but I'm going to type it slow here and twice. That's the main reason I made 2 tables. The other stuff, the reviewing that relationship, just seemed useful since we had 2 tables. The main reason I had 2 tables is to have it twice. So make sure you're jotting this down or typing it somewhere while I'm going over it, because this one is a mess. Because we have to spell out all the instructions and give it details about the type of data we're loading into. So we're going to we're going to load data in file. So we're loading in some data that is currently located in a file. And then we say where that file is. And this is a normal string path, so this one does get quotation marks. So the file is located on the C drive. In the XAMPP folder, there's a folder called MySQL. And in that, there's a folder called bin. And that should have a file called people.csv holding the data we actually want. So give it the whole file path. Load data in that file into a table, and then the table we want to load it into. So into people, and that part's very straightforward. Load data in file into table, and then we have to say the file and the table along the way. But there's lots of formats we can put our data in. So we have to describe how this data is in that file. And that's those 3 things I put on the board earlier about a CSV file. Each field is separated by commas. So fields terminated by a comma. And it's a text file. So that means everything that it reads from the file is going to come in as a string, which means quotation marks around it. So enclosed by quote marks. And what's there on my screen is kind of the standard way to do this. You could use escape sequences, but since it's a quote mark inside of quote marks, most people just do single, double, single. We'd get the same, obviously we would get the same effect from doing double, single, double. As long as there's one mark inside of as a string, or escape sequences, those work. And then the third point is each record takes up a line. So then we have to add in lines terminated by a line break. But what kind of line break? That makes a big difference. And for that one, you have to know how the file was created. Our rule of thumb is usually on a Windows machine, it's going to have a carriage return and a line feed. Whereas on a Linux or a Mac machine, it's going to have just a line feed. But that's not always the case. Do y'all know the difference between carriage returns and line feeds? It goes all the way back to typewriters. Has everybody seen a typewriter before? Familiar with those? Seen them in history books or something?
Yes, history.
So a line feed is just turning the thing. We have that, our paper wraps around the roller.
My typewriter was fancy. It had a little tape in it that actually would go back and like erase your legs. So we thought we were pretty cool. But I guess
there was a bunch of them. But yeah, those pieces that move the paper back and forth because our letters were always in the same spot. Something had to move that back and forth. That was called the carriage. So a line feed is when we would just roll the carriage and we were still at the same spot on the paper. We might be in the middle of the paper, we might be at the left, we might be at the right. We're still in the same spot. We just moved up to the next line. A carriage return was the button on the typewriter that would roll up to the next line and move back to the beginning. So a line feed only goes to the next line. A carriage return line feed goes back to the beginning of the next line. So there is a difference between them. I'm going to put in a line feed because I know that's going to cause an issue here. And I want to point out how to spot that issue. And then we put a header row in there. We don't want to insert our labels. Those are just labels so that that data has some meaning in it. Then we also can add in the command ignore so many rows. Our headers only took up one row, so ignore one row. Okay. Yeah, I find I tend to always type that last little bit in there because it just seems really, really strange to me to have a file full of data with no labeling on it whatsoever. It just seems like something that belongs there. So that's what that looks like. Load data in file, in the file we want to load stuff from, into table, the name of the table we're going from, and then the rest of that's always the same for a CSV file. The fields are terminated by commas and enclosed by quotation marks, and each line is terminated by a line feed. Excuse me for 1 second. I didn't realize my window was still open. I put a curtain, closed the curtain, and didn't realize the window was still open until there was a bunch of noise out there. Sorry about that if it came through on the mic and stuff. So fields terminated by line feed, and we're going to ignore a header row. And it says 4 records were inserted. If I run a select query on this, select all from people, that looks kind of weird, right? It didn't line up very nicely. Looks like this first thing's missing altogether. If we do select per ID from people where name equals Sally, well, it's there. It just didn't show the first time. So that's what happens if we say the lines are terminated by a line feed when it's actually a carriage return line feed. It throws off our formatting. So if you see that, you just scroll back up to the query and add in the carriage return, which is \r. So that's how our lines actually end. And vice versa, if you have ones that actually end with only a line feed and you put a carriage return line feed, then it won't load them because it'll say I can't find the end of any lines. So that's how to spot those two errors. Oh, whoops, duplicate stuff. I was supposed to, let me drop that first. Delete from people where everything is true. Okay, so it's all gone now. Now scroll up to that last one that told me there was duplicate data on everything that time and run that again. So it inserted it, and this time it should be formatted better. So select all from people. Now it looks like normal. And then we can load in our other data the same way. So our query, let me scroll up so I'm not at the bottom of the thing. We want to load data in file. And then what file are we loading? Are we going to look at? On the C drive.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Why did one logically? How did one deleting where one delete the duplicates? Just
True.
logically, right? So, but I mean, with it having two, how did it find with true? How did it find the duplicate by using?
Where
using-
true, everything.
Okay.
That's all conditions.
Okay.
If I put where 0, that would find nothing.
Okay. Okay.
that-
Okay.
That help?
All right.
So where true is everything. Every single condition we could put in there is met. Versus where 0 or where false, that would mean no condition is met. No condition could be met. So yeah, that's just everything.
Thank you very much for explaining that.
Yeah,
I got it.
every possible condition is met. MySQL / bin, and then we had that taste.csv file. Whoops, I was using single quotes. So load data in file, then that file. And I'm going to split it up this time. Probably make it look a little bit better. I think I meant to do that the first time. I'm just so used to doing it in one row. It flowed out of me like that. So I'm going to split it up this time, but it still looks like a mess. So we have that data, and we're going to put it into a table. In particular, we want to put it in the taste table. And then we have to describe it. Well, we have field, it's a CSV, so we have fields terminated by commas and enclosed by quotation marks because it's a CSV in text format, and each record goes into its own row. So then we have to say, or each line has a record, so we have to say how the lines are split up. Lines are terminated by, well, we already saw, it's a carriage return line feed. So \r\n. We don't just want to go to the next line. We want to go to the beginning of the next line, is what that is the difference there. And finally, we have headers in our data. So we're going to ignore one rows just because it's odd to have a file full of data with no labeling on it whatsoever. So I put it in there, and now we should be able to select all our data. So select all from people, join taste. I'll just do this all at once, where our primary foreign key matches. So our relationship holds. Where people.perID is equal to taste.perID. And there, we can see all the data went in there, lined up nicely like it was supposed to. We can at least look at those those keys and see that they matched up and it lined it, put everything in like it was supposed to. Command prompt can be a little tricky to work with, right? So exit out of this. Then we want to delete those. So usually if I'm doing it this way, I create them, write the text files, and do it all in the command prompt, and then before closing this, delete them. But since I did it the other way, I'll go back over there. Then you want to remember our working ones are in the delete folder, and we had to move those to work with them. So over here, we want to make sure we delete those. And the CSV ones are easy to spot. There's initDB. So, whoops. So your .sql file, depending on how you have your computer set up, it's going to have different icons. So that one you may have to dig through and look for. But the CSV ones will probably be the only thing in here with your default spreadsheet icon. So they're a little easier to spot. Just make sure you delete those. Purge them now that we're done with those copies. So that's how we do that in the language. But that was quite a bit, right? Very straightforward.
Yes,
Very straightforward, but
it's not that it's, I mean, it's a lot, but I feel really comfortable with that language. I mean, I know it's not one language, but the formatting of it, and like you said, the words being very relative to what you're trying to do.
The one language thing, like you said there, Tim. Often we've got to know that language to work it into our script. But this would be a security issue if we put this in if we put this ability on our website, right? On the front end, where just anybody on the internet could jump in there and pass that instruction into our computer, right?
So is that why, with that being a vulnerability risk, is that why, like the hosting sites you said that we're not able to create the databases because maybe there's the vulnerability of, like you said, it being the whole database being, okay.
There's that, or even if you can't create databases, if somebody could pass this in and then run a whole bunch of these, that'd make for a very easy denial of service attack, right? One of the classes when I was learning the language R, programming in the programming class, our classroom example was all the cholesterol data. It's a huge data set. All of it from the CDC, all of it that's ever been collected from people alive and people that have already passed away. There's a huge data set. It takes a while for that CSV to load in. That would make if somebody could do that, it would be very easy. So when I was originally putting things together, I went ahead and prepared that, and then was like, why am I showing this? This is a vulnerability. These topics only happen on the back end. It's really easy because all we need to do is just write that query in the script and pass it in, or load in a file like we did the other day, and then read that as a text file and pass that right in. So it's really easy, but it's kind of risky to put it on the front end. So we're just going to look at this in the SQL. This is more of a back end thing, which means we also have PHP My Admin to do it with. And that's probably what we're going to use. But we should maybe take 5 before we do that. I'll go ahead and pull up PHP My Admin, logos/PHP My Admin. And we have, this is the most popular interface, but there's no shortage of it. If something else comes along and becomes more popular than things like XAMPP, the standard tested environments will use the one that's more popular. Right now, PHP My Admin is the most popular, so we have access to that and have buttons for anything we want to do on the computer, including this button right here, which makes all of that stuff we just did seem extra hard, right? When
Which
There's this
button?
clearly
Can you
labeled
show
button.
that button again?
Import. We're going to look at that after a break. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? That sound good? So it's 2:28. So we'll get back to it at 2:38. That sound good to everybody?
Perfect.
And then we will start with that easy one that we're actually going to do, which will go really, really quick now that we've talked about all the concepts. And yeah, really, I already know where the button is. You can figure it out from there, but we'll still go over it. And I will see y'all in just a moment. I need to go get a coffee.